Now available in paperback and coming to Kindle Unlimited. John Haynes, Dark Succubus. The man who rules the world is tempted by a sultry succubus in this all-new John Haynes series adventure. Get John Haynes, Dark Succubus in paperback or pre-order on Kindle Unlimited today. Yesterday, it was speculated that Kevin Feige would no longer be a part of Spider-Man films and that the Spider-Man character would no longer be a part of the MCU. And the reason why Kevin Feige will no longer be producing Spider-Man films and Spider-Man will no longer be a part of the MCU is because Disney, the owner of Marvel Entertainment and the Spider-Man property, and Sony, the owners of the Spider-Man license currently, could not come up with an agreement for profit sharing. Now, your Disney and Sony were negotiating a possible 50-50 split. Unfortunately, Sony did not believe that this was a fair deal for them because Disney still owned all of the merchandising rights for Spider-Man and the rights to license merchandise for Spider-Man products, and Sony thought it wasn't going to get a fair enough deal as related to merchandising with only getting the box office alone. And this deal, when I take a critical examination of it, shows that the Disney seems to be a bit greedy as related to the Spider-Man property. Now, the last movie, Spider-Man Far From Home, made over $1 billion. So if your Disney was already making a lot of money on merchandise like t-shirts, video games, and action figures like those in the Marvel Legends line, then why couldn't they give Sony a bigger cut? Because Sony was the one who was going to go out here and distribute the film, and they were only going to get the box office. So it looks like your Disney was getting a little greedy. Moreover, it was looking like your Kevin Feige was looking to try to grab more control over the Marvel Cinematic Universe and Marvel Cinematic properties like he did with the Netflix deal that he scuttled, which severed the connection between the Marvel Netflix universe of Daredevil, Iron Fist, Luke Cage, Jessica Jones, and the Punisher from the MCU. And when I look at your Kevin Feige's actions here, they mirror the actions as related to the Netflix deal, and they show how your Kevin Feige is looking to get way more control over the Marvel Cinematic Universe and is trying to overly control the Marvel Cinematic Universe by having it all under his one hand. And I don't think that's a good thing for the Marvel Cinematic Universe to be solely under the control of Kevin Feige. When I take a look at what the guys over at Netflix did on Luke Cage and on Daredevil, where they showed that their craftsmanship was far better than what we got in many of the MCU films, which felt repetitive and boring. I mean, the Netflix shows of Daredevil Season 3 and Luke Cage Season 2 felt just like the comics come to life, and Daredevil Season 3 was basically, literally, a page-for-page adaptation of parts of the Frank Miller run. And Luke Cage, under the auspices of the brilliant Chio Hodari Coker, elevated the character to new levels, and in Season 2, we were getting a build to a very great storyline, and it showed that the Netflix writers, once given some creative control, could go out of their way to produce some really well-crafted stories, like they did in Daredevil Season 3, and Luke Cage Season 2, and Punisher Season 1, which was also another great series, which showed a literal translation of Frank Castle from comic book character all the way to television series. So when I look at Kevin Feige and his need for control, it's looking like he's putting a vice grip on the Marvel Studios and the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and from the looks of Phase 4, that control is not something that I think is a positive thing, because your Kevin Feige believes that the future is female, and it looks like he's trying to inject identity politics in many of these Marvel Cinematic Universe films like Phase 4 and like what was injected in the Spider-Man Homecoming film, a film that did not really feel like a Spider-Man comic book, like Sam Raimi's classic 2002 Spider-Man and the iconic Spider-Man 2. Both of those movies literally felt like comic books come to life, but when I looked at Kevin Feige's Spider-Man Homecoming, it didn't capture the spirit of Spider-Man, it didn't capture the heart of Spider-Man, and it took away many of the great elements of Spider-Man's story, things like J. Jonah Jameson, the removal of Uncle Ben, and with great power comes great responsibility, the removal of Robbie Robertson, the black editor of the Daily Bugle, and in his place, which was sad to see, because Robbie Robertson was one of the great characters in Spider-Man as a black character, he was replaced by numerous forced diversity characters like your MJ and many other characters, which replaced core essential characters like Harry Osborn, which are paramount to the Spider-Man mythology. So your Kevin Feige's Spider-Mans never really felt like Spider-Man, and with Spider-Man being mentored by Tony Stark, it oftentimes felt like a ripoff of Batman Beyond and not the Spider-Man I grew up with and many other people grew up with. And it didn't really feel like those Steve Ditko or John Romita comics from back in the day. So your Peter Parker from the MCU never really felt like Peter Parker from the MCU, and he felt too soft and too teenagerish, and it was hard to really connect with his version of Spider-Man, who really did not push that whole theme of with great power comes great responsibility. That was something that was sorely missing from Spider-Man Homecoming, which felt, again, like more of a Disney teen sitcom than a Spider-Man movie. And Spider-Man Far From Home continued this adaptation where it didn't capture the spirit of Spider-Man. And that movie on the trailer looked a lot more like Agent Cody Banks than a Spider-Man film. So that was quite troubling for me as related to the Disney versions of Spider-Man, in that they weren't staying true to the source material and that they were deviating from the source material in a way that mirrored eerily your Joel Schumacher when he took over the Batman franchise. And the way your Spider-Man films looked and felt really did remind me of Joel Schumacher's Batman franchise. And yes, the costume looked a lot like Spider-Man in the first movie, but the big problem was we didn't get to see the real Peter Parker, the science guy who invented things on the fly, the highly creative and resourceful Peter Parker, or the Peter Parker who went out here and made his own money in order to support himself and help take care of his Aunt May. We didn't get to see any of that, nor did we get to see any sort of remorse as related to the passing of Uncle Ben, which was something that is essential to the Spider-Man mythos. Just seeing this is the thing that drives Peter Parker to be Spider-Man. Instead, we get a young, hungry, ambitious kid who is just eager to go out here and fight crime, whereas Peter Parker in the comics is always haunted by the fact that when he didn't stop the burglar from robbing the wrestling arena, that it led to him winding up losing his Uncle Ben. And that's the thing that motivates Peter Parker to fight crime, but we never got to see that element in Spider-Man films. Instead, with Spider-Man Far From Home, we got everything about Tony Stark, but Tony Stark is not Uncle Ben, and he's a poor substitute for Uncle Ben. And when I look at these Spider-Man films and think about Kevin Feige deciding to pull Spider-Man from the MCU, in some ways I believe that this could possibly be a blessing in disguise. Now, I know many people don't really like Sony's Spider-Man films like The Amazing Spider-Man and The Amazing Spider-Man 2. And after watching both of those films, they felt very bland and very generic. So I understand where many superhero film fans have an issue with Sony. But when I look at the character and the way they have been mishandled over at Marvel Studios, which is really sad because this is Marvel Studios, they should have had a better handle on Spider-Man. I believe that Sony is a blessing in disguise, especially when you consider that Phase 4 is talking about the future is female, and it looks like we're ushering in the era of SJW MCU. So your Spider-Man may be in a safer place, and Sony may be looking at Phase 4, was looking at their investment long-term and looking at the value of the character long-term and making efforts to protect the character property long-term because they had 2 more films that they were planning to make featuring Spider-Man. So they didn't want their character and their investment tied up with SJW MCU, identity politics, or social justice narratives. And maybe your Sony, this is their core reason for pulling out, along with the agreement, understanding that creatively your Marvel Studios is just going in the wrong direction under your Kevin Feige, and that your Kevin Feige seems again to be too obsessed with controlling the MCU instead of giving people space to be creative. And what he's doing here is similar again to what he did over at Netflix, and we saw what happened over at Netflix in how those properties wound up becoming disconnected from the MCU in the same way Spider-Man is becoming disconnected from the MCU, all because Kevin Feige wants all the power and control. And I believe this obsession with power and control may lead to the complete undoing of the MCU, because with your Kevin Feige, yes, he was the great visionary and the architect of the first 3 phases of the MCU, but under the last couple of films of the MCU, like Endgame, Ant-Man and the Wasp, and your Infinity War, it's clear that his vision is really becoming unfocused, and with Phase 4 being a bit of a mess, it's looking like Kevin Feige's grand vision is starting to turn into a complete disaster. If you'd like to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the link in the description box. And if you want to try some of my SJS Direct fantasy fiction, like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, the John Haynes series, and the Spinsterella trilogy, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and e-readers, Spinsterella. Discover the dark side of love in this goth and lovely romance with Spinsterella. Get Spinsterella in paperback and e-readers at your favorite online bookseller today.